I believe that Israel has a powerful stranglehold on the American government.
Our borders are wide open. You have 3,000 illegal immigrants coming across the border every day. My God, what is the country coming to? And we're guarding the Israeli borders, the Mideast borders. We're in Afghanistan, we're in Pakistan, and our borders are wide open.
You don't make anything better by adding 30 million Mexicans to it, do you? No American would agree with that. And yet no American would stand up in public and say it. And that's a symbol that we're not free. We may be a lot of things, but we're not free. When people are afraid to speak the obvious, you're not free.
The big watershed event in immigration history until 1965 was the law of 1924. Until that time, America's borders had been pretty open to immigration. Of course, at that time, most of the immigrants came from Europe, but increasingly from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And that was creating a problem, because these people were different from the Western European immigrants who had come before, who were assimilating quite easily. And I don't think there was ever going to be a big problem with Italian immigration or Eastern European non-Jewish immigration. Those people were a little more difficult to assimilate, certainly. But the big problem was Jewish immigration. Jewish immigrants came to this country and they were very, very different from the people who were here before. And the most important difference was that they were deeply committed to these leftist political agendas. If you go over to Eastern Europe at that time, political radicalism was a Jewish subculture. A lot of them were intensely Zionist and so on. There was this hotbed because Jews were under extreme pressure in Eastern Europe. Their populations had expanded. A lot of them were impoverished, and their response to this was to become politically radical. So when they came to this country, they were A, poor, but they were B, politically radical. A lot of them were Zionists. They were extremely intense. These were the people who were organizing all these radical leftist movements. They were revolutionary. They supported the Soviet Union. And Americans were just horrified at this. And beginning actually early in the 20th century, there was attempts, and even in the 1890s, to shut down immigration. Jewish activist organizations were at the forefront of keeping it open. And of course, their main interest in those years was to get more Jews over from Eastern Europe. So there was a movement in this country to end this free immigration from Europe or elsewhere. So it came to the head in 1921. They finally passed a law. The purpose of the law really was to create an ethnic status quo. They didn't try to ship the people back that were already here. But they felt that these people were not assimilating well, and we needed a timeout. And the whole point was to create an ethnic status quo. So the idea in the 1924 law that finally solidified all this was to retain the ethnic proportions that were in the country as of the 1890 census, and then later as of the 1920 census. So the point was to have an ethnic status quo. So that future immigration would be based on what percentage you were of the country as of 1920. This seemed fair to the people who were behind it, but of course Jewish activist organizations rejected this. They wanted more of their people to come over here. They described it as racist and so on. And basically what was going on was that the great majority of the people in the country were finally saying that they had an ethnic interest in preventing future immigration. They wanted the country as it was. They wanted to be a European, Western European culture. That other groups were welcome, and that they would welcome their contributions, but they did not want to be overwhelmed. They didn't want to lose the culture and the ethnic mix that was characteristic of the country at that time. And of course, Jewish organizations lost this battle. So then, after the 1924 bill passed, Jewish organizations didn't stop trying to change it. But then in the 1930s, you had the Great Depression, and so it was even harder to change the law because we're not going to allow millions of people into the country when there are already 25% unemployment. But nevertheless, they kept pushing, especially for Jewish immigrants from Europe, because at that time you had the rise of Hitler. And so they kept trying to change things. But nothing much changed until after World War II, the immigration battles heated up again. The 1952 law that was finally passed basically reaffirmed the 1924 law. It was passed over President Truman's veto. Jewish activist organizations were deeply involved in trying to overturn this legislation. So between 1952 and 1965, they never stopped. They kept creating organizations, funding organizations. Finally, by 1965, with the landslide in 1964, bringing Lyndon Johnson in, the Great Society and all that, the immigration law was finally overturned. All the ethnic quotas that were built into the 1924 law were overturned as racist. It was promised at that time that it wouldn't change the ethnic balance of the country, but certainly in the minds of the activists who were behind it, that was just a ruse. They knew darn well that the attempt really was to change the ethnic balance of the country. And after that law was passed, one of the main goals was to simply increase the ceilings on immigration. In other words, to increase the absolute numbers. Once you got rid of ethnic origins as a criterion, other parts of the world were fair game.
1965, America was about more than 90% white. In fact, there were more Americans of Swiss descent in 1960 than a Mexican. Today, about 1 in 10, actually I think it's edging towards 1 in 9 Americans is a Mexican. Not literally a Mexican national, although there are many of those, but of Mexican descent, and that's a remarkable change in 30 to 40 years.
The reforms in immigration that have completely altered this country have not been the result of popular sentiment. They've been the result, really, of elite sentiment and, frankly, ethnic interest group lobbying and so on. Since 1924, when they lost that, Jews have had a huge animosity towards the culture that did that. Jews, as I said, have, because they see Western culture as fundamentally anti-Jewish, going back to the Middle Ages, they have wanted to essentially end European domination of this society. And I think they're well on the way to doing that.
When something bad happens, there's a reason. And the reason that the borders are open is that the Jews opened them because they wanted to mix in tens of millions of third worlders because they thought it would be safer for them. They're more safe in a diverse society. That's the reason.
The critical issue is the issue of Jewish power. And by the way, this is not simply Jews. It's the ideology that these Jewish leaders have, and most Jewish organizations have, that they believe that they have a divine right to rule us, to be supreme over us. It's a supremacy. It's not even a separate ideology, or it's not a separatism, it's not an egalitarianism. It is a supremacy position. Judaism, at its root, is a racial supremacist religion. And their power in media and their power in government today, not only in America, but their influence is great, of course, in England, and it still reaches into other European countries, though it's not as great as it is here. It influences every other issue, whether you're talking about gun control, or whether you're talking about abortion, or whether you're talking about world trade, or whether you're talking about the Iraq War, or whether you're talking about affirmative action. This issue is the critical issue, because by controlling our mass media to a great extent, they're able to dictate what happens. By controlling the politicians, they're able to dictate what happens on not just the issues affecting Israel, but many other issues affecting America. For instance, Americans are shocked, a lot of typically conservative Americans who are very much opposed to this mass immigration, which is transforming our nation into a third world country. They are very surprised to learn that immigration, the change in Americans' immigration policy and opening our border, that this policy was almost entirely led and affected by the Jewish supremacists. Almost every Jewish organization for the last 70 years, in fact, it took them 70 years, they started their work to undermine our immigration policy from literally the turn of the 20th century. So starting from around 1900, it took them 65 years. For 65 years, they worked to destroy America's demographic base, to make European Americans into a minority. And of course, in my book, Jewish Supremacism, I quote from many Jewish leaders bragging about the fact that they led this effort. And of course, they not only led it in terms of the actual congressional legislation, they also led it from the standpoint of the media, trying to tell people in America that somehow multiculturalism was a great advantage, that it was going to be a great benefit to people, when we know that so-called multiculturalism leads to greater crime, dislocation, racial insensitivity. In fact, racial tensions arise from it, that a community's sense of brotherhood and togetherness and unity is destroyed by so-called multiculturalism. And when we look around the world and we see multicultural states and multicultural communities, they tend to be far more violent. They tend to be far more disruptive. There's a lot less love and a lot more hate in those kinds of environments because it's human nature. People are different. But anyway, the people who have been the architects of this change have really been Jewish supremacists. So unless we strike at that core ideologically, unless we expose this Jewish supremacist domination over our media and government, we're never going to have any real victories on these other peripheral areas.
It was basically the 1965 Act that eliminated the national origin quota system and the Asian Pacific Triangle. Up to that year, we had 125 Asians that were permitted to come in here, all based upon the discriminatory parts of American policy. The Torah and the Talmud teach us that we must welcome the stranger in our midst. It's written in Leviticus that the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. If we refuse...
At the time of the 1965 immigration law, it was widely stated by Teddy Kennedy and many others that this act would not change the ethnic balance of the country. And yet the very same people who were behind this law immediately, as soon as it was passed, did everything they could to increase the numbers to the point now where it's about 1 million legal immigrants a year, plus uncounted hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants.
Chinese, we just recently had some Croatians. Last summer, a great number of Brazilians. Geez, I think from everywhere. And, or, you know, Guatemalans and then Salvadorians and Colombians and you name it.
Very interesting to look at what Jewish organizations have done recently. They have allied with Mexican American groups. They have allied with Asian groups. They have allied with black groups. In other words, they see themselves as part of a coalition of ethnic groups, and very self-consciously so. And those groups are going to become increasingly strong as time goes on because they're representing a greater and greater percentage of the population. But they see themselves, I think, as they have from the time they got here, as opposing the interests of European Americans. I don't think there's any question about that. The people who oppose immigration, they talk about, well, there are economic problems and this and that. No one simply says, Europeans are not going to benefit from this as a group, that we are giving up control of our country to other peoples, that there's a huge problem with this, that when you are a minority group, you better hope that the other groups in society are nice to you. Well, we Europeans should be concerned that our future will be as a minority group, and we will then be at the whim of coalitions that may have very hostile intent towards us, that we will lose control of our own future. That's the issue here. It's as simple as that. But even raising European ethnic interests is the big taboo of this period right now. We can't even raise the possibility that Europeans have ethnic interests. It's the taboo topic. And yet everybody else has ethnic interests, which are legitimate.
The idea that diversity is a strength in mixing people, it's not a strength. The strength comes from the homogeneity and having people who are basically alike. I mean, diverse people break up because they don't want to be around the other people. That's just natural. You don't see diverse species getting together and mingling in nature. You see them avoiding each other or fighting for territory. The white man knows all this. He doesn't know it at the level of facts and specific understandings, but he senses the spirit of the times. No rational person would open the border with Mexico for 100 reasons.
I think that ethnic conflict, we can already see that on the horizon. And I think we're already getting to the point in this country, white people are now 70%. As you get towards 50%, you're going to see increasing amounts of that, where other ethnic groups are simply going to start flexing their muscles, and they're going to demand a greater presence of, say, Spanish in the public place. We're going to see more Spanish spoken in public arenas. We're going to see the decline of Western culture. We're going to see increases in affirmative action directed at underachieving minorities. And I think young white people are going to feel the brunt of this. And one of the problems I think right now is that most middle-class white people don't feel these pressures. Their children are going to feel them. And I think it's the children who are going to change and start to exert their interest. Because if they don't exert their interest, they're going to be the first group in history that hasn't exerted their interest. It's as simple as that.
The problem is for the next generation. That's when the hurt's going to come about. You know, you can't have a country, I think the Roman Empire proved it. The Roman Empire was very aggressive, was very strong. They ruled half of the world, I guess. And so what happened after they ruled half of the world? They got soft in body and mind. They had all these slaves come and do all their work and did everything for them. So what happens? Eventually the slaves took over. The Roman Empire just was thrown away. You gotta stay organized. One language, one group of people.